All right. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. We have a very exciting webinar planned on communications considerations when going public. And I'm thrilled to be joined by this all-star cast of communications experts, all who have successfully navigated and counseled other brands on IPO best practices. So I will start by introducing our panelists, Toni Iafrate, longtime V2 client and Chief Communications Officer at UiPath. UiPath is an AI-powered automation company that achieved the third largest software IPO in history when it went public in 2021. We also have with us Chantelle Darby, the head of comms at Accel, a top VC firm that actually backs UiPath, as well as brands you've probably heard of like Bumble and CrowdStrike and Slack. And lastly, we have Donna Stein, an adjunct professor at public relations at Syracuse's SI Newhouse School of Public Communications, where she was recently named the inaugural recipient of the school's Outstanding Adjunct Professor in PR Award. Donna also brings more than 45 years of experience counseling pre-IPO and public companies. So welcome, Toni, Donna, and Chantelle.
Thank you.
So before we dive in, and we have a lot of questions that we want to go through, and just a quick housekeeping note to our audience. We are going to be covering a ton of ground today. If you have questions at any point that you want to chime in and ask, feel free to do it whenever, and then we'll reserve the last 10 minutes or so to go through as many of those questions as we can. So without further ado, let's get into it. I wanted to start just by acknowledging kind of the state of the IPO market today. Obviously, the market that we've seen in the past year or so is very different than the one we saw in 2020 and 2021. So I wanted to actually turn it over to you, Chantelle, as someone who's on the front lines talking day in and day out with investors and portfolio companies. What are you thinking? We've seen reports that we may see an IPO resurgence in the new year. Do you think that's true? What are your thoughts?
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and with this awesome crew. Yeah, I mean, I think everyone, not just Accel, but everyone in the industry was kind of hoping that with ARM and Instacart and Klaviyo, that might be the moment in time for the IPO gates to open up again. And unfortunately, it didn't look like that was going to happen this year. But with that being said, I think we do believe that things are going to change, and probably in the summer months, we'll probably start to see more companies get ready to consider going public again. I think now more than ever, factors like profitability are more important than they ever were before. We're often seeing, companies are bigger than what they used to be. So whereas maybe previously it used to be maybe 150 to 200, we're seeing probably companies need to hit that 500 million mark to consider going out. But I think by and large, everyone across the board is, optimistic that 2024 will hopefully open up again.
Yeah, good. Well, glad to hear it. And I know the road to IPO from a communication standpoint is a long one. So even if they're starting to think about it in May, June of next year, the communications considerations can't be ignored, even as early as, Q1. So Donna, I'd love to hear from you in terms of, as you're talking to your clients and your students, what are the first things that companies and their communications teams should consider if their brand is entertaining an IPO?
Again, thank you for having me, Kristen. I was really excited about this. It's really important to have an experienced communications team in place before you go public. And that means the functions for corporate communications, public relations, investor relations, if possible, marketing and media relations, employee relations, and customer relations are really, really important. Everyone needs to be on the same page, and there needs to be a narrative that is going to resonate across all of the platforms and all of the initiatives. An IPO is usually a 12 to 18 month process from start to finish. And companies need to start their communications at the very beginning and act as if they were a public company then. And I'm sure Toni will tell us a lot about her experience at UiPath and how they did that. But it's really important to start realizing what the SEC regulations are going to be for reporting and to make sure you have your financial controls in place.
Mhm.
In addition, it's a good habit to start having a proactive outreach of communications going before you go public, because as it becomes a matter of course of business for your company, you can continue to do that after you file the S1.
Yeah.
And it won't run afoul of any SEC regulations. And it won't also violate the quiet period that we have. The success of an IPO really depends on how you communicate your company's story, and to make sure that it resonates well with all of the constituencies that you're trying to reach. It's also important to have your team communicating with board members, experts who are advisors, and pre-IPO investors to make sure that they understand what the company's story and strategy really is.
Yeah.
Communications teams are really charged with developing a compelling narrative to tell the story as soon as the public becomes public, and it's really great to start at the very beginning.
I would just add really quickly to that too, because Kristen, you talked a little bit about, thinking a few months in advance. I actually think we should be thinking years in advance.
Yeah.
Which I know may feel a little bit odd, but honestly, like I think 18 months to 2 years is really when you should start building what does our go public plan look like? Because you need to start executing those campaigns that Donna was referencing,
Right.
then versus 3 months out, it's too late.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Toni, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the work we did with UiPath, starting as early as 2018, 2019, because I think UiPath really did an exceptional job of building this brand and really acting like a public company well before it technically had to. So maybe you can kind of spell out some of the goals and strategies that you enlisted.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. I joined UiPath November of 2018, and the company ultimately went public in April of 2021. But I think from the moment that I joined UiPath, it was critical to have the IPO mindset.
Yeah.
And what that means is you are really charged with building the communications infrastructure for the organization. And in my case, that wasn't just from an external point of view, but also from an internal one, right? So I was basically the one-person comms team up until a week before UiPath's IPO. And so when you think about building that communications infrastructure, that really means everything from the news flow of what you have to work with. It means really investigating throughout the organization. What are the moments in time? What are the critical points that we want to make sure as an organization that we are announcing, that we are pushing to the right stakeholders, both internally and externally. So it does really, it's everything from who's our spokesperson bench? How do we get them prepped to be able to speak to the press?
Yeah.
What are the communications guidelines that we as an organization have to ensure that our employees understand? Because there are only certified spokespeople that should be talking about financial metrics, and some shouldn't, but here's what they can speak on. So it is really building that communications infrastructure from the ground up. And to Chantelle's point, it is very much so that you are already operating as a public company, even though you have yet to go public. And I think bringing that kind of mindset to your sort of position day one on is incredibly important. I was saying this to somebody last week that communications really is the center of an organization. And I think any way you slice it from a pre-IPO point of view, comms is the forcing function. It absolutely is.
Yeah, I love that. I guess to get a level deeper, when you say you want to act like a public company, what does that entail? And specifically, you mentioned two things that I think are worth going into a little bit more detail on. One is, sharing financials and really being transparent about where you're at as a business and where you're going.
Yeah.
And I think the second thing too, that I also want to spend some time on is really empowering your CEO, your CFO, maybe there's other people in the mix, to be out there, not only championing the vision and the mission, but also the company's momentum. So can you talk a little bit more about, what kind of moments in time like lend to that, how you prepare your executives to tell the best narrative, as Donna said?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, at a not to say tactical level, but I think at a very important level was announcing news like we were a public organization. And that meant basically putting out quarterly announcements that talked about the company's financials, the company growth, key growth that we may have been seeing in very critical parts of the business, whether that is to upskill and reskill a certain amount of people with automation. Right? It's to sort of many folks, automation can be looked at as a bad word. And so a lot of it was to show the uptick of how, Fortune 10, Fortune, 500 organizations were using this kind of technology to really enhance their own operations. And the best way to show that kind of momentum was, again, putting out that news so that the world could really understand. And then, Kristen, to the second point, it did really lend itself to that second point. It was a forcing function to get our spokespeople and key members of our, X team aligned on what that narrative was, right? Based on what we were seeing in the business, what's the story that we want to tell? And it could be specific around, there's one industry where we're seeing a lot more momentum. And why is that, right? And then how can we continue that thread throughout the quarter to tell more of that story? So having those kinds of announcements done from a quarterly point of view, one, it gets the organization ready for when you are in the public markets, right? And what's that FAQ look like? What are those questions going to be? How do we prep? How do we all sing that same tune? Right. And again, though, right, it's also from an internal side. I don't want to forget or let this audience, walk away with not feeling like the internal side. The internal side is just as important to the external side, because your employees are your best advocates for the organization. And so how do you make sure that they're also part of that same exact journey that you're sharing with your external stakeholders?
Let's talk about that. And Chantelle, Donna, feel free to chime in here as well. But, that's something that I think a lot of brands probably don't think too much about as they're thinking about their path to IPO, is the importance of internal communications. So, presumably if you're on the path to becoming a public company, you're a pretty large company. And so you have a lot of employees that you need to consistently engage and arm with, the right content and messaging. What kind of content do you need to arm them with, and how often should you be engaging them so that, again, they're kind of helping you further champion the company and what you're trying to build?
Yeah, I'll just say, very specific to a pre-IPO phase, right? I want to really focus there. But we had a whole internal campaign that we had basically developed for our internal people. And our ticker symbol happens to be PATH. And we really wanted to stress that the IPO was just a moment in time. Things were just now getting started, right? Now it's when it gets really, really real. And so our whole internal comms campaign was around this sort of motto of just another milestone on our path. And it was really a way to get folks to understand and get very, very focused on what that, public company phase was going to look like. And so that included everything from presentations on when the S1 flipped and what that now meant, pointing out very key specific areas for our own people to sort of delve in and dive into. But it also, included things like, how do you deal with stock and taxes, right? For many people, this is their first time going through this. It was for me, right? So having a firm understanding of tax, of what the tax stages may look like, or what you do with your stock once it's vested, and those, people are only as smart as you arm them. Right. So that was a very key focus area for us, right? Keeping folks, very much, I think part of it and really engaged from the onset. And I think especially as a company that went public during COVID,
Yes.
when people could not get together. Having that strong cadence of times when we could, even if it was on Zoom, was very, very, very important.
Yeah, I just add to that too, just on the information front. We've seen companies, people want to talk about the company, they're proud of the company. And, Toni was talking a little bit about, you have to be thoughtful about what, you share as a representative of the company. And so I've actually seen other folks actually set up something like a Twitter channel or a social channel. And so folks can subscribe to that. And so they know like whatever shared in this channel is okay for me to repost or reshare or whatnot. And it's like a super simple tactic, but it's actually really effective. And I also just want to reiterate the importance of internal comms. Like I think it's probably one of the most important, if not the most important area when it comes to IPO. And so being really thoughtful about ensuring that your people feel involved in it and educated, I think is a really important investment.
I also want to talk about the role of investors, and Chantelle, while you have the floor, because I think probably also important to a company's road to IPO is leaning on additional champions like investors, like board members who can help kind of trumpet their story and build the brand. So I want to talk about the role that your investors typically play as it relates to their portfolio's company's communication strategy in the lead up to an IPO. What's appropriate, how often, you had mentioned, I think that you and Toni built your relationship years ago.
I know. I actually can't believe you said you started in 2017 because that means we've been friends for like 7 years, coming on 7 years, which is insane. But no, I'm happy to speak to that. And so I think, oftentimes there can be a little bit of a perception that, your investors or the investing team can maybe be a little hands-off or not involved. And, I just want to say that, folks like myself, especially on the marketing side, that's part of our job is to help, help people like Toni and other folks within our portfolio to navigate this. And because more often than not, you haven't been through an IPO before, it's a remarkable thing to go through. And, there's a tremendous learning curve. And so, Toni and I started our relationship years in advance. And so we were really lucky to kind of have that bond when it was time to start this entire march. But I would encourage you, even if you think you're a few years out, is to get to know the various marketing leaders with your investment firms, because one, they can absolutely support you when this time comes, but we also have, a whole kind of like toolkit of, various vendors and agencies that you might want to consider, best practices. And, I think one of the things that I'm most proud of at Accel is honestly our network. And so Toni is a huge part of that. But, she and others have been so generous with their experience of taking a company public. And that's something else that we can help with, is making sure that you're connected with other leaders who have either recently gone through an IPO or, maybe a few years out. But folks want to help. They're very generous with their experience. And I think Toni is a great example of that. But we've certainly found that valuable, is connecting our companies with people who have been there and done it before, and to get that perspective, whether it's choosing what exchange, it's how to think about your media strategy, it's what you've done from an internal comms point of view, it's if you use an external media trainer, all sorts, like there's so many variables to think about. I think on the other side, the investors that are on your board specifically obviously know your company inside and out. And so, if and when it makes sense to lean on them, and Toni and her team used one of our partners in the lead up to it, but, to help share your story and help folks understand that story. And I think last but not least, and maybe we're going to get to this down the line, but as you really get close to that date, the IPO date specifically, is I would also just make sure that you as the comms leader or the marketing leader you set expectations for what people's roles are on listing day.
Yeah.
It's a really exciting day. Do you want your board or other investors to talk to media? Do you just want your CEO and CFO to talk to media? Do you want them to help promote on social? I think those are things that variables you don't necessarily think of. And I think just throwing out an email a few days before on like, these are our expectations, is super helpful for everyone. So they know what role they're going to play.
Yeah. No, I love that. You started talking about it, but in terms of how the partners themselves can help tell the story, like where does it make sense to kind of plug them in? Should you connect them with the firm's agency? How exactly do you find is most effective to actually do that? Or do you use your own networks to kind of go out and be like, I'm talking to CNBC today about XYZ while I'm there. Now's a great time to kind of talk about
Yeah,
Klaviyo
I
or
mean,
Slack.
it kind of depends on what stage, right? But we're often having conversations with reporters day in and
Yep.
day out, and often reporters that like, Toni, for example, wouldn't necessarily talk to because, they're more business or public event reporters.
Yep.
And so, again, like when, kind of the pre-everything, just kind of sharing more about these various companies then is absolutely something that we think about. And being able to, flag news once it comes live is definitely a way to leverage us.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just share quickly, Kristen, right? And this is pretty tactical, but I think it's a really good tip.
Yeah.
Right? Is every time we had major news at, UiPath, or the company had won a major award, or we were doing a large social push around a piece of content, I would share that with all of the marketing contacts at all of the firms in which we were working with from a investment point of view. So Chantelle knew the moment that we were doing this, or, the next person knew, right? And so I think it's just a good way to constantly be in front of these folks that can be so impactful, and Chantelle certainly was. But I think it's also just a good way to then leverage these great people to share your news on their own channels, right? When you think about, social is part of my purview too. And when you think about the follower base or the engagement rate, that, something from, Chantelle and her team is going to be a lot higher than, a pre-IPO startup that's just trying to get, build out their own brand. So I think it's very critical to grow the, relationships early.
Yeah.
And then use those, throughout the entire process.
Yeah. I'd also just note too, because now I'm like remembering all of this, but in the lead up to when you're booking meetings, like depending on what the media strategy is that you confirm with the team, like, I can remember Toni and I like, having multiple calls a day of like, we can't, we're not able to get this reporter. Can you help with that? And that's again where our relationships come in, where, we're able to like pinch hit or whatever it might be in those instances.
Well, and that actually brings me to kind of the other thing I wanted to talk about is, are there specific placements, that every company on the path to IPO should almost strive for? Like, right now we're in the process with a lot of clients who want to get on the CNBC disruptor list. And I remember that was, such a big deal when we won that for UiPath, a few years ago. Are there awards or events or again, profiles that a company should kind of highlight at the onset of their communication strategy as like, this would be a huge win for us as we embark on our journey?
Yeah, I mean,
or is it totally dependent on the brand and where they sit and, in what industry they sit in?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that the CNBC Disruptor 50 is, I think, a list that many companies aspire to be on. I think when you look at how many years it's been in existence and you multiply that by 50, that's a very, that's the creme of the creme, right? So I think that's certainly one that is very important. But I think it's also looking at If your goal is, this is a first time, CEO that's bringing a company public, or this is a founder and this is his first rodeo or her first rodeo, it's, what's your goal, and then building the strategies around that. But I would say for us, we certainly leaned into industry analyst recognition, like being in the Gartner Magic Quadrants or the Forrester Waves, and being, a leader there, because that drives true demand. But then it's also some of these, the Fast 500 lists, or the Disruptor 50, or the Cloud 100. So I think it does, in a sense, depend on what industry in which you play in, but it also depends on, like, what are the true goals of what you're trying to do.
Yep.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it depends on the company and the brand and the goals at the end of the day. One thing I think is valuable too is just thinking about your relationships that you're building. So like maybe less coverage driven. And again, like as you're thinking about the 18-month to 2-year period, building those relationships early on, and they might not result in any coverage at that point. But when you do ring the bell, and those folks are the ones to write the story, they have a much deeper context of who you are over, the cycle of years or months versus like immediate in that moment.
Could not agree more.
One thing I wanted to talk about, this is switching gears a little bit, but we mentioned last week, and I think you just brought it up again, Chantelle, is the S1. For people who don't know, I'd love if one of you could kind of define what that S1 is, what it means to flip it, and different communication strategies that a company might consider, to mark that milestone moment. Donna, maybe do you want to kick us off?
I can start that off. A Form S1 is a filing that a private company makes to the SEC, citing its intent to want to go public. And it includes business information as well as financial information. Since July of 2017, the SEC now allows every private company to do what they call a confidential filing. Before that, it wasn't the case, but now any private company can do a silent S1 filing to kind of test the waters with the SEC, get some feedback from the SEC, and then determine what is going to be the right time to flip that or make that public filing make that private filing public. And it's really the map or the guidebook, if you will, for a company as it starts to embark the formal IPO process.
And how far, what is the timing between the S1 flipping and the IPO?
It usually has to be done at least 15 days before the roadshow starts. And that 15 days is meant to allow potential investors, to read the document, understand what the company does, where the company is, and be prepared for when the roadshow does start with the company's management team to tell the story and to try to drum up interest in the offering itself.
Great. So I know one thing that we talked about briefly last week was just the different communication strategies that a company might consider when the S1 flips. Chantelle, do you want to speak a little bit to that? And maybe Toni, you can kind of walk through what UiPath did.
Yeah, I mean, I think once the S1 flips, and if you choose not to do a confidential filing, anyone can see it on the SEC site. And oftentimes, that's some reporters' favorite thing, right? But I've also seen more recently, I think it's come in vogue to issue the press release announcing a confidential filing, which is a little bit ironic, but I think it's taking a little bit, the premise is to take more control of the situation, right? Versus the news leaking. So I've seen it done multiple ways. I think it's just really based on what, works best for the company.
And Toni, remind us what UiPath did.
Yeah, so I went back and checked. We did not issue a press release the day that the S1 flipped and was live. I do, in fact, remember it was we were like timed. We were on the Slack channel, and there was like 5 of us. I'm like, it just flipped. Like, hit the internal comm. You know, I mean, it's that orchestrated. But I think, you know, from our point of view, I think we were a highly anticipated IPO, and we knew that regardless of issuing a press announcement, we were going to see the level of interest that we knew that we would see. And so we saved one of those press releases for you know, later in the year. But no, and I think, Kristen, you know, I actually have our S1 here, and it's like this thick, right? And I think what's really important, once you know that S1 is going to flip, is where you want to point investors to as they're talking to media, and where you yourself may want to point folks to in a, you know, in a, you know, best way as humanly possible, right? So there's obviously, you know, the S1 also includes things like where we could see challenges, or where, you know, so there's certain information that you want to be sure that you're driving your stakeholders to. And I think knowing those numbers inside and out, having a clear understanding of where you want to drive people, because those are the kinds of stories you want them to tell. And by the way, it's not cookie cutter. Some you want to tell a different story, and some you want to tell this one, right? So I think having a really good understanding of the S1, going through it, you know, you may be part of writing it, you may not be part of, but at least comprehending it and understanding it and pointing media to the right parts of it, that's absolutely your job to do.
So then we flash forward, or go ahead.
Can I just add one thing
Yeah,
too, Kristen? Is I don't think we ever talked about the quiet period, and that might be
no,
worth,
we didn't. Thank you for bringing that up
here, because with the S1 flipping, I mean, you're, and correct me if I'm wrong, Donna, but the quiet period starts when you start talking to bankers.
Right.
And you know, when the S1 flips, you're squarely in the quiet period. And so you know, one thing we've counseled folks on too is just when they're talking to their internal teams as well, like, you really can't be saying anything at all that's not publicly available.
Unless it's contained in the S1.
That's when reporters get all the information and the numbers and whatnot, and there's, you know, all sorts of varying degrees of coverage, but you can't comment on it. And so it might be, Donna, if you want to share a little bit more about the mechanics behind the quiet period, that may be valuable.
Well, yeah, I mean, but as I said earlier, if you get into the habit before you ever file an S1, secretly, confidentially, whatever, if you have a noted routine of issuing news whenever anything happens, and I know UiPath had that, Toni was smart to put that in place, then you can continue to talk about your business and new developments and things that happen even when the quiet period is in effect. But the quiet period actually technically starts when the S1 becomes public knowledge, and it doesn't end until 25 days after the IPO prices. So again, if you have established a criteria where you routinely are able to disseminate news, you can continue to do that. But during that quiet period, the only information technically that a company is supposed to be talking about is what is contained in the prospectus and the S1 filing.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, you know, what I will say though, right, is a quiet period does not mean a silent period.
Yes.
And I think that's very important for us as comms pros to understand and to challenge in a sense, right? Outside counsel became my best friend because I would challenge them and say, well, you know what? The CEO and founder is only going to talk about exactly what is in the S1, including how the company was founded. So why can't he do that? Right. So I think, again, you have to have a firm understanding of what the guidelines are, because if you don't, you're just going to sit back and sort of wait. And at that phase, you can't sit back and wait. You have to think about, okay, there's a thought leadership platform. We have to continue with the you know, contributed pieces, or we have to leverage customers to tell a certain piece of the story, or we have to leverage more industry spokespeople, right, to tell more industry specific stories. So don't confuse the quiet means silent, because it does not. And you
That's
have
a really good point.
right? Like you have to be the voice because you know what is right and what the company needs. And sometimes you will get the smackdown from external counsel, but that's how you're building a relationship with them. They understand what your goals are, and you're going to be their right-hand person to make sure that we don't do anything that prevents this IPO from moving forward in this time frame.
Well, and I think you bring up an interesting point is, you can lean on third parties to help tell your story. So even if, you're not out there as,
That's right.
pounding your chest as much as you otherwise might, can you lean on customers? Could you lean on investors? Can you lean on analysts? So I think there too, thinking about the people in your pocket that can help tell your story, is a good strategy.
That's absolutely. And listen, right, I think this is absolutely a time to really double down on how you're advocating with your own customers, right?
Yep.
And really thinking about how you're using them as true advocates, because what organization, doesn't want to be tied with this hot and buzzy company that's about to go public with technology that is changing the world? Right. Many do, and there are some that will say, well, no, we can't, but you got to take advantage of the ones that can.
Right. So you file the S1, you go through that exciting couple of weeks, and then, we get to the big day. And as much prep that you can do, years and months in advance, I think there is inevitably going to be some unknowns on listing day. One being how the stock actually performs. So Donna, I'd love if you could talk a little bit about the importance of PR and IR collaboration, because I think it's really important that PR is very attuned to how the stock is performing so that they can best message that to external stakeholders. So can you talk a little bit about what that process should entail, how to build that relationship early?
Sure. Well, a successful IPO really hinges on the investor demand for the stock. The more demand that there is for the stock is going to go up. It's a higher price. And the optimum listing day is when the company goes public, starts trading, and at the end of the first trading day trades up from what the initial public offering price was. In everybody's mind, that's a success. And when the underwriters actually try to work with the management team to price the shares, they hope that's going to happen. Then they try to price it so that does happen, right, Toni? There's a lot of play that goes into that. Believe me.
Absolutely.
I've been in rooms where people have been offering over 50 cents. But it's all a game, and everybody knows how to play it. But it's really important that all along the corporate communications team, the internal communications team, and then the investor relations team have all been in sync and have been doing their parts in their individual roles to tell the same story. You're telling it to different audiences, but you want to make sure that it is the same story and it is consistently applied to all of the company's various audience and people that matter.
Yeah, and when you do finally price the IPO, and I actually remember this like it was yesterday, sitting in my hotel room waiting to get the price so that V2 could push the news out over the wire, is it's like that's within the next day or two, like you're going public, right? Like that's when it becomes very, very real. But when you price an IPO, you absolutely do issue a press announcement. It tends to be one that's written more by the lawyers than anything else. But that is a critical piece of news that hits that, again, just keeps the momentum building.
Yeah. Let's talk about the day. You started to talk about it. And actually, right before we got on, you were talking about how you were up at 4 a.m. I mean, it's an incredibly exciting day for any company. Tell us a little bit about what's involved. You were on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange with Daniel, the CEO, with Ashim, the CFO. Tell us about, your role, kind of coordinating interviews, keeping energy up. And I'd love to also know, what surprised you about the day? And, if you were to change anything, what would you maybe change looking back?
Yeah, so I'll start with the internal comms side of things, because in working with the New York Stock Exchange, and again, because this was during COVID, we were able to pull off an all-employee webinar / all hands that was coming to everybody live from the floor. So we had, Daniel was being interviewed on the floor. We had many of our, employees that were at home that we, brought on to talk about the company's values and just different things that we wanted to really highlight on that day. That's such an important day for everyone. And you want everybody to feel like they are part of it, that they can celebrate. And we did a lot. We sent out celebration boxes to every single person. And so, there was that piece, which I certainly was, playing a very, very important role in. I think, once you ring the bell, the stock doesn't start trading like immediately, right? Like it takes a little bit of time. So once it begins trading is when you can really, it's when stuff becomes very much more so real. And so again, I was the sole person there from a comms point of view. We had 16 interviews scheduled, which by the way, for a listing day is a lot. So we had our co-CEO or our CEO and founder doing some of them. We had our CFO doing others. Some they were doing together. And I was sort of running back and forth. And so I think this is where you have to be sort of the, Jack and Jill of all trades and think about everything you may need on that day that you don't have. That could be an external camera. That could be a ring light.
Yep.
That could be a lot of different things, right? And it's an exhausting day. Like I remember we had a break during, and the CEO went to take a nap on the couch because, he was exhausted. It was a big day and we still had interviews to go after that.
Yeah.
Right. So I think if there was one thing I could change, it might be maybe skimming a couple of interviews off the top, but at the same time, they were there for it. Like they were in it just as much as I was, and they loved every part of it. And I think that's a day you can never replicate.
Yeah.
Right. You can bring another company public, but it's not going to be that company. And I think it's just something you can't replicate. And I got to tell you, I had the time of my life.
Well, even,
Ringing the bell is so much fun.
yeah,
It was so much fun.
I remember that day. It's like, it was one of the most exciting days of my life. And I was like in my apartment from home,
I got married after the IPO, but I still think of the IPO. So, but it's such an incredible day. And it's not something that many people in our roles ever get to see. And I think to be a part of it is something truly special. And you just have to take advantage of every second.
And if you're thinking about listing on NASDAQ, think of it this way. You get to be shot up on the NASDAQ tower in the middle of Times Square for everybody to see you.
Absolutely.
That's thrilling too.
Yes, it really is. It really is.
So after the big day, it doesn't stop, so I'd love to talk a little bit about, once you become a public company, how your program evolves, if it evolves. I know we've talked a lot about, acting like a public company before you are, but, are there things that inevitably shift? And, presumably earnings calls is one of them. But I'd love to talk a little bit about kind of considerations for evolving your communication strategies to represent where you now are as a brand. So Donna, I'd be curious as to your thoughts on this from a high level.
Sure. Well, once the company goes public, the emphasis is really going to be on managing investor expectations and making sure that the company is performing the way that they said it was going to perform during the IPO when they were attracting all of the investors. The company now has to be accountable to a much wider range of people. Sometimes CEOs, first-time publicly traded CEOs and CFOs have a difficult time doing this. They almost wish sometimes out loud that they didn't go public, because then they could have run their business the way they wanted to. But once you go public, you've got to grow up and be able to be accountable to anybody. But one of the things, again, every company that goes public, I don't care what industry you're in, after you go public, it's all about growth. The main issue is people want to know how the company is going to execute its business strategy, what it is, and how they're going to grow their business quarter over quarter. It's not just year over year. And it really takes a lot of time and effort on the people in the communications team to make sure that they are telling the story and they're providing investors and the media with the road path to how the company is going to do this, and then report back on when they're making milestones and achievements. And it also means telling your story within the realm of SEC regulations too.
Yeah.
You have to be careful there, and you have to make sure that the material information that you are choosing to give is meeting all of the disclosure rules that have to be met first, so that you don't run afoul of the SEC.
I'd love to talk a little bit more about earnings calls, because I know we've talked about the first one being so critically important. Toni, maybe you can talk a little bit about the strategy for the first one, just in terms of, how do you ready your executives for those? How do you think about your communication strategies? Like, do you want to do media? What type of media? All of that.
Yeah, so it's a great question, Kristen. And what I can tell you is our preparation for quarterly earnings started far earlier than our first earnings call. So we did we did at least two sort of almost like test earnings call with real company financial data prior to going public. And so that meant everything from writing the earnings script to writing the press release to getting on a call and me reading that huge thing that IR people now have to read prior to earnings calls, right? And so it was important for us to do that, because it's the Q&A part after that becomes rapid fire. Like, you have to be ready for that. And especially when we were a first-time CEO bringing a company public, a first-time CFO bringing a company public. So getting them in that mode and having them take them very seriously, and having folks like Rich Wong and others be a part of the FAQ session, folks that have been through IPOs and have been through quarterly earnings time and time again that could provide real feedback, was important. Right. So I think as that first earnings call came to bear, I think we were, in good shape from the, mechanical parts of it, like the earnings scripts, the FAQ, and this and that, right? I think from a media point of view, I think it's difficult, right? I think I've always been of the mindset that if we're going to do media for earnings, we got to do it every single quarter, regardless. Like, you got to show up when things are really great, and you got to explain when things aren't so awesome, right? So we've done some, we haven't done a ton, but we've also been a company that has been through a few transitions.
Right.
And so, but at the end of the day, it really is making sure that your executives are primed with the right message that you want to share to your internal and external audience.
Yeah, and instilling trust that the company is continuing to grow and do what it said
Absolutely.
it would. Yeah.
Absolutely, Kristen. And what I'll say, right, is, even prior to the company going public and ringing the bell, you and I were thinking about what that big story we wanted to tell following the company going public, right? So I think we as comms folks, we have to think ahead all the time. And thinking ahead means from, something that could happen the night before you go public, to when you do go public, to now, what's that path forward?
Right. Well, I want to pause because we have a bunch of questions that have popped up in the chat. So let me just pull some of these up. Oh, this is interesting. Derek says, prior to going public, should communications or the leadership team tell employees that they have plans to go public? And if so, when?
Chantelle, do you want to start?
I'm trying to reflect back. Again, I think it's up to the company, but sometimes folks tend to trend towards wanting to keep things close to the vest, which I completely appreciate. With that being said, I think, again, like, your employees are your champions and they're your brand. And so I think, if you can communicate to them, like, your plans, and do it in a way of, obviously, we're informing you because we are a part of the company and we trust you. And we want you to be aligned on our mission. I think it's always good to trend towards that. What did you guys do, Toni?
it's a fine balance, right? I think, specifically during company all hands and those things, I think there was always a lot of questions around that, right? And I think the company never made promises
Yeah.
about,
The timeline.
exactly,
Yeah.
right? Because especially, again, I mean, not to keep bringing up COVID, but it was a very unique time, right? Where like it was different. But I think it also depends on what kind of company you have been from a transparency and openness point of view up until that point. Like if you're a company that's completely transparent and sharing a lot of info, that's where it can be tough to suddenly like turn that off. So you have to do it in a way that works for your employees, but also works for the regulations that you have to, keep
Right.
your eye on. So what I can tell you is I think it was when the S1 flipped was when there was a real internal comms, again, written primarily by lawyers that talked about that, this was sort of the, this was the stage now that we were at as an organization.
I mean, some early stage companies, in order to retain talent and to recruit talent, will sometimes talk about the big picture for the company down the road that, our intent is to go public one day. And, people who start working with us now will have an opportunity for options and all that kind of stuff. And, I think it's okay if you kind of keep it in the future. But I agree with Toni. I think that the real time is when the S1 flips.
Yeah.
And then it's in the public domain. So
yeah, I mean, listen, right? If you're a company that has attracted a lot of funding, I mean, there's only two ways out. There's only two ways to exit. One is being bought and one is going public, right? So I think most folks understand that. And I think they also understand that, a company can only say as much as they can possibly say, even to their own people, because the risk is too high.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But a great question.
Yeah.
I don't think if I've ever, I don't want to say I don't think I've ever seen, but by and large, I think the companies that have had, to your point, Toni, like a very transparent relationship with their companies, I don't think I've ever seen a situation where it's actually an employee that's leaked.
Yeah.
That type of news.
We have another question in here. Is there a preferred frequency in the amount of press releases and news that you announce in the months leading up to an IPO? And of course, I think the quiet period kind of factors in to some extent here, but would love to hear your perspective.
It's that cadence that you've already set, right? Just as Donna said, I think if you're a company that has set a news flow where you're issuing, an announcement a week or sometimes two, and we were certainly that company just because we had that much news. I mean, there were always lulls at times.
Right.
But when you set up a cadence where you're issuing, 3 announcements a month or even 2 a month, you've set that tone now, right? So all the way up to going public, like you've set yourself up really, really well. And that's why, when you first go into an organization, pegging what you can announce as news, what you have coming up, what that looks like. If you have to manufacture news, which by the way, again, like that's part of our jobs. I mean, I manufacture news every single day, right? So it's like, how do you keep that cadence going to keep your brand out there at the forefront?
Great. One last question, and I'd love for all of you to answer this one. What was your biggest lesson learned from, going through this experience, whether you're having done it directly or counseling brand? And what's the number one thing that you would say to somebody considering this path?
I think, lesson learned, I think lesson learned and path are at least for me, probably the same thing.
Yeah.
I think it's, you have to be a voice and you have to be a force. And if you're not comfortable being that person, providing that level of guidance and pushing back and challenging while always keeping your eyesight, your number one priority, the sake of the company, like you have to have guts, because without guts, there is no glory. And believe me, there, so many times you have to go back and fight a little bit harder because something's right, or that, it's going to make a difference in how the company is perceived. Like you got to be that person. And I think, we as comms people, like the role is strategic. It cannot be transactional. And I think leading up to an IPO is when push comes to shove. If you're just going to be the transactional type that's going to take something to turn it into something, it's not going to work.
Yeah, I just add, I was part of Yelp going public like 400 years ago. I don't even know, it was a while ago. And then of course in my role at Accel, I've had, you know, the great fortune of working with many folks like Toni and various companies going public. And I think for me, in all those instances, it really is relationships. So I kind of just harken back to, you know, when I had the opportunity to be part of the team that took Yelp public, I had never done it before. And so getting to meet and learn from other folks, and I don't want to say like humility, but you know, you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And I think being really open to learning from other folks, and then obviously you can filter through that and what works best for your strategy and your company and your goals and whatnot. But for me, it's really been kind of the relationships and the learnings, and being really open to that.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, in the 45 years that I've been doing this, it never hurts to be over prepared. You just gotta be prepared. And, you know, fortunately or unfortunately, that role falls on the communications person and the PR people. And we're paid to anticipate or try to anticipate every possible thing that can happen, good, bad, or indifferent. And so being prepared and making sure that everyone is on the same page. And, you know, you go out and raise all this money. Well, people want to know what you're going to do with it.
Right.
How is it going to support your growth strategy? Are you going to start doing a roll-up strategy where you're buying out other competitors to get to scale? What is it? So you have to make sure that you're prepared and you know exactly what it is you're going to do, and then go ahead and execute against the plan that you told everybody that you were going to do.
Love it. Well, I can't thank you all enough for joining this webinar. This was an awesome, super informative discussion. And I feel like we could go for a long time. You know, we really only just scratched the surface. For those tuning in, we will be posting a summary of this conversation, both on the V2 website, as well as on our social channels. So stay tuned for that. And if you have any questions for anyone on this panel, feel free to reach out to me. My email is actually on my little name on the screen, kleathers@v2comms.com. And I'm happy to answer any questions from an agency perspective or pass along questions for Donna, Toni, and Chantelle. So thank you everyone for joining, and hope everyone has a great holiday.
Thank you. Happy holidays and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.